Hi, welcome back to Engine Shop Joe. The end of the year's here, so I wanted to just update you on some things that I thought you needed to know. And I've got a list of some technical bulletins with their numbers. So forgive me for not looking at you, but I'm going to be reading off of this list so that I don't tell you the wrong thing. And the technical bulletin numbers, by the way, if you've got access to QuickServe Online, which if you don't, go back and look in my video list for the video on how to get a free QuickServe account, QSOL. And once you open to the main page, up in the top right, there is two search boxes. They're just white colored boxes. One says your engine, one says all engines. Just type it in the all engine box, and you'll type TSB, those letters, and then the numbers that I read after them. And then you just hit enter and it'll give you a link to that TSP. So that's the easiest way to find those. So here we go, some updates for the end of the year, things you'll need to know next year coming up. TSB 220095. The ISX has ISX QSX engine and X15. There's a new oil pump part number. The most current part number is 5680039, and that's as of 2023. And back when they made the ISX in 98, it had a cast iron oil pump. And then sometime probably in the early 2000s, like 2004 to 2007, they changed it to aluminum to cut down on the weight of the engine, and they've been using that ever since. And they decided to go back to the cast iron pump because I don't think the aluminum pump would do not all of them ran 1,000,000 miles, and the cast iron pump pretty much would, unless something went through and chewed it up, of course. But so they changed back to cast iron. The cast iron pump, the part number I just read off, pretty much all oil pumps supersede to that. And the aluminum pumps, you had to buy shims and shim that out and check the gear lash with feeler gauges when you put that pump up. The cast iron pump, you don't. You just put it up and you're done. So next, TSB 2038. That's 200038. When they first changed back to the cast iron pump, they had 4 different part numbers. You may have one of those part numbers in your engine. There's not a thing wrong with them, except in certain cases you might hear a whine or a buzzing sound coming from the front of the oil pan down towards the bottom of the engine. And that was the buzzing was coming from the oil pulsating in the pump. It did not hurt anything. It wasn't a problem. But again, it was a noise people weren't used to hearing, so they got a lot of complaints about it. So they figured out what they had to modify in the pump to make that go away. And they superseded all those part numbers, one of which was 533-2492, up to the current number, which is 568-0039, and that one doesn't buzz. So if yours has a buzzing noise, don't worry about it. It's not a problem. The last thing I'll say about the new pump is your oil pressure could be different, plus or minus 6 pounds at idle hot, at idle cold, revved up hot, revved up cold. If you're a stickler and look at your gauge and really keep track of that pressure, don't worry if it's plus or minus 6 pounds with the new pump. Cummins says as long as no fault codes are logged for oil pressure, then the pump is functioning correctly. And I agree with that. So plus or minus 6 pounds doesn't mean anything in that engine. Okay, next. TSB 230051. If you've got an Eaton Ultra Shift transmission with an ISX or QSX and it doesn't want to start, take a look, or doesn't want to crank actually, you turn the key and nothing happens. Take a look at the shifter. If the fault light's on, you need to hook up a scan tool and make sure you can communicate with the Eaton controller that's bolted on a transmission. If that controller quits communicating with the engine ECM at key on for any reason, when I say that, it could be a wiring problem, water in a connector, a broken wire, or the controller, the Eaton controller itself is having issues or failing. The engine will not crank, period. So that TSB 230051 talks about that in a little more detail. This is one you'll probably be surprised to hear. TSB 230100, a new press fit ISX block and press fit liners. The first engine number in production to have that block and liners is 804-32526. So that's a pretty new engine, right? 2023. So what they did is they had some trouble with the liners moving a little bit on some of the blocks and wearing the counterboard ledge. So they machined a ring right at the bottom of the block, and they machined the liner so it's got a ring right above where the O-ring is. And if you look at it, you'll see it looks like a half-inch band that's kind of shiny right above where the O-ring would go. And if you see that, it's a press fit liner. They do have a part number, but the liner has to be ordered separately. Again, TSB 230100. That tells you everything you need to know about that. TSB 230104. If fault code 2198 becomes active during the VGT hysteresis test and is not accompanied by fault code 1894, don't worry about it. It was a software glitch. Just clear that fault when you're done with the hysteresis test. And the VGT hysteresis test is a diagnostic test that basically moves the actuator from 0% to 100%, that rack, back and forth about 3 times. And as long as it makes full travel, then it passes. TSB 210134. Engine fuel filter remote mounted with soft lines. Possible fault codes 559, 4691. Possible external fuel leak. Possible crank no start. Possible engine stalls or shuts down. This is talking about when the filter that's normally screwed on the engine has a remote kit put on it with lines where they mount it on a frame. Usually this would be a machine, not a truck, where they mount it on a frame because that side of the engine isn't accessible. Some of the crane models, I think the 18,000, Manawak 18,000 does that. You can't even touch the fuel filter side of the engine, so all the filters are on the other side of the engine. But they used to use Strataflex lines. Now everything's going to that plastic stuff. And if you put a bend on that plastic where it hooks on and the line's being pulled, then where they heat shrink that nylon line onto the fitting, it can start to open up and suck air. That's kind of what they're talking about. So if you got a remote filter with those soft lines and you start having problems, that's the first place you want to look. The line itself, where the nylon line is heat shrunk onto the fitting that snaps onto the fuel filter head. TSB 22160, a new variable geometry turbocharger actuator sealing gaskets are coming out in the kits. You might see 2 different kinds of gaskets. Now, when I say gaskets, these are O-rings. So one O-ring will look like it has little bulges every so many centimeters all the way around. The other one's going to look like it has 2 little tabs to one side and a tab going the other direction, kind of like a triangle, if you will. Your eye could draw a triangle on the tabs. So they're not, those 2 gaskets are not compatible with the grooves in the VGT motor. So if you pull a motor off and you get a kit to put it back on, and you're going to use it over, and there's two different gaskets. Look at the old O-ring and put the correct new O-ring on. If you put the wrong O-ring in, you can get a bunch of fault codes for the turbo actuator binding, that kind of a thing. So remember that if you see those two different kinds of gaskets. TSB 220-204, fault code 1682-3574, all the way up to 5755. There's a bunch of them. Those are all on the DEF pump. About a dozen fault codes on the DEF pump itself. So the pump stops working and you've got all these faults. What they're saying is all the pumps they're getting back have nothing wrong with them. The TSB again is TSB 220204. If you have DEF pump problems, take a look at that, because basically what they're saying is the load test, the OEM wiring, all the wiring that goes to that DEF pump plug, load test all of it. Next year I'm going to be doing a video on using the Load Pro tool. It's a very nice tool that a company developed that takes all the guesswork out of loading, the mystery of how to load wiring circuits. So that's what Cummins uses. They used to use a headlight, but people still did that incorrectly with a headlight. They didn't measure voltage drop. They just plugged the light up, and if the light came on, they said, hey, the wires are good. But that's not really the correct way to do it. So anyway, Cummins is saying it's the DEF pump wiring in every case. All the pumps have checked out okay. Last, TSB 220096, fault code 5383, after treatment diesel particulate filter ash load percent. That is an actual fault code, but it's a maintenance fault code. You're going to be seeing that on anything that's 2022 and newer, or 2019-ish that has the current release calibration update if it's automotive. This is automotive. And it'll probably be going to industrial very soon if it hasn't already started to. But you'll get a check engine light while you're driving. The fall will be 5383. And then the light will go off, but a key on the check engine light will stay on 30 seconds longer than it normally does and then go out the rest of the day. Whenever that happens, that signifies you have a maintenance fault. And this fault will be telling you that, hey, it's time to replace the diesel particulate filter. If you don't want to use that, you can go into the maintenance section or manual for your engine, and they will usually have an hour or mile rating. Personally, I would use the 5383 because you'll get the maximum life out of your filter. And once that comes on, it's not like you've got to stop your trip and go get a filter put on it. We had a truck that ran another month after that came on before we got it in and put a filter on it. So that's the way to go if you've got the newer engine. So that's my updates that I thought were important for you to know about. I hope you all have a good holiday, and take care, and we'll see you next year. And thanks for subscribing to Engine Shop Joe and supporting the channel. Thanks for all of your comments, and thanks for constructive criticism. I always appreciate that as well. And we'll see you next year. I hope you have a good next year too.